Welcome to the Radicailín podcast. In this episode, we interviewed Dr Renate Klein, feminist researcher and activist, and also biologist and social scientist. Renate is a co-founder of FINRAGE, Feminist International Network of Resistance to Reproductive and Genetic Engineering, and also Spinifex Press. She has written extensively on reproductive technologies, including surrogacy, and their harmful effects on women and children. We asked Renate to talk to us about how she became involved with the issue of surrogacy.
Yeah, now I'm a biologist from Switzerland, and but I also studied women's studies in the US at Berkeley, and then I came to London in the early 80s to do my PhD, and not on reproductive technologies, but on women's studies as a theory and practice. And then at some party, a woman said to me, "And what do you think about these test tube babies?" Because Louise Brown, the first test tube baby, had just been born in 1978. And I said, "I don't know, I haven't really thought about it much. I don't think I think anything about it." And she looked at me and said, "You're a biologist, you should do a book about it." And I thought, yeah, I should finish my PhD. That's what I should do. But sometimes, some comments, they take hold of you. And I asked two of the friends in the US, both scientists, and they said, yes, let's do a book. So quite frankly, we had really not a lot of idea about any of this, but we asked for papers. And remember, these are the days before email. We used faxes, we put calls for papers into lots of journals, many more journals at that time. And we got snowed under with papers. And after a year or so, we had a collection which was called Test Tube Women, What Future for Motherhood? And it was the first international feminist book on reproductive technologies. And as we got paper after paper after paper, we got more and more and more critical. And so at the end of getting that book together, we all said, no, that's not good for women. It's not choice. It's not something we should support. I think we have to really speak out very strongly about it. So that book came out in 1984. It got translated very quickly into German in 1985. The Germans had a very, very big congress with over 2,000 women in 1985 and condemned, reproductive technologies and genetic engineering. And at that point, it has really changed. At that point, it was feminists, it was unionists, it was the Green Party, it was churches. And it was really, the ordinary woman and man on the street who were all against these developments. And nowadays, IVF is just like, oh, yeah, let's do IVF. So unfortunately, it hasn't changed for the better. But in 1985 also, we founded a network called FINRAGE, Feminist International Network of Resistance to Reproductive and Genetic Engineering. It had, at its height, it had chapters, as we called them, in something like 30 countries, and we were more than 7,000 or 8,000 women involved. The important thing about this network was it wasn't just against new reproductive technologies like IVF and surrogacy. It was also a critical appraisal of contraceptive technologies, because we had lots of women from Bangladesh and India, Malaysia in FINRAGE, and they said, oh, you can't just talk about IVF, you have to talk about the abuses that go on with very harmful contraceptives, like Norplant, for instance, which is one of the early implants. And unfortunately, I have to say that today, this side gets hardly talked about anymore. We're really now onto, in our criticism of surrogacy, it's surrogacy, or a little bit of criticism on IVF, it's IVF. But the fact that so many poor women in Africa, for instance, are sterilized against their will or given harmful contraceptives, that's the other side of the coin. In the West, so-called infertile women should be given every bit of support to do IVF. But in poor countries in the south, they are sterilized against their will. And we don't really talk about this anymore. So anyway, ever since then, I've been active. I couldn't really get off it. I then I moved to Australia and I started to teach in the women's studies program, where we had a fabulous course on reproductive technologies and genetic engineering. So our students, they learned all about the evils of IVF and surrogacy. And that lasted until about 2006. And then in 2015, actually, a new network started in the US called Stop Surrogacy Now. And I've been very active in that. It's a very broad church of people. It's not just women, it's men also. And the founder, Jennifer Lal, is a fabulous woman who really drives this. And there's a website there if you want to have a look, Stop Surrogacy Now. And more recently in France, there is also a network. I don't know if you know about that, ICAMS or SIAMS. And Marie-Joseph Devillers and Anna Luana Stoica-Deram, they push this along. And that's really very good because they look more in what's happening in Europe in terms of surrogacy, which is not good. It's really not good.
What exactly is surrogacy, and for people that might not be as familiar with it?
Well, I would say when two entitled people, and they can be a heterosexual couple or they can be two gay men, increasingly more so, who now think that they are socially infertile. And, I'm a lesbian, so I can say this thing. This is not homophobia, it's just saying it how it is. And so they think that they need a baby. They need either another child or they need a child with some of their genetic material in it. And so they usually go to a surrogate agency. And that's in those countries where surrogacy, commercial surrogacy is allowed. And that's not many. It's some states in the USA, it's Greece, but only for heterosexual couples. It's Cyprus. And some other states, but most countries in Europe, as you know, don't have any surrogacy at all. England has so-called altruistic surrogacy, and they have had this very, very long inquiry, and we kind of waiting. What I know they want to probably make it more like commercial surrogacy. Anyway, so they go to this surrogate agency where they look at pictures of women. It's like you look at pornography on the internet. And so, because they sit there, they have to pose, and it says, attributes, very friendly, very clever, very high IQ, loves dogs. And then they select one of these women, and then also, if they're two gay men, they of course haven't got any eggs. So they also have to find an egg donor. And again, there's pictures of women like in pornography sites. They look pretty and they say, oh, I'm blonde, have blue eyes, very high IQ and very sporty. And so then they maybe, choose this woman. And so then they buy eggs from her. And then they go to this woman, but that's the agency does that, and say, okay, we've got a couple that would like you to carry their child or their embryo for them. So in other words, rich people buy a woman's uterus, buy her 9 months. It's like as a breeder, as an incubator. It's a modern form of slavery. You can't say it in any other words. It is reproductive prostitution. And then it goes. If it goes, and often it doesn't go at all, because IVF is notoriously unsuccessful. So they often have to have 2 or 3 attempts, and then the pregnancy can be very difficult for the women.
And so who are these women who are surrogates? And I'm doing quotation marks around that word, obviously, like socioeconomically, yes. Where are they from? usually.
These so-called surrogates, and thank you for making that comment, because of course surrogate is a terrible misnomer. They are not any kind of replacement. They are women who from their own blood and bones create these new human beings in 9 months, and then have it taken out, often by cesarean, and give it away, and often they don't see it anymore. So it's taking away babies from women, and the babies of course have never been asked. So yes, these women, without any exceptions, are from socioeconomic poorer classes, like at India and Nepal and Thailand and Cambodia. They have all closed down surrogacy, but when it was illegal, it was very clear that these women, especially in India, where we have a lot of information, were really amongst the poorest of the poorest. And despite the fact that they got only a very small fraction of the money that the baby buyers had to pay, for them it was a lot of money. And then we saw things like their husbands then use the money to gamble or maybe buy a house in their name, and then they say to their wives, oh yeah, well, you need to do it again, we need more money. So it was on top of the terrible stuff about being a surrogate, with all the dangers that entailed. They were also really pimped by their husbands. But that has been stopped. There is a bill in India that actually officially stops commercial surrogacy for foreigners. Now, it's probably still going on the ground, but officially it has been stopped, and Nepal and Thailand and Cambodia as well. And just another sentence, I've always said, if surrogacy was really something so noble and so wonderful, why don't we see CEOs who are surrogates for their cleaners, for instance? If they believe so strongly that this poor woman was a cleaner and is infertile, or her husband is infertile, we are going to be a surrogate for you. We will never see that, because it's not about that. It's about the rich ruling and using poor women really as slaves. Nothing much has changed.
One of the arguments made by pro-surrogacy advocates is that women choose or consent to enter into surrogacy. So what would you say to that argument around choice?
I think it's not a real argument. And I have big problems with even using the concept of choice. In my books, I only use choice when it's between choosing between two good things, like, would you like a chocolate cake or would you like a lemon tart? So that's two good things. But to say, can you choose to be a surrogate? I would just say it's a nonsensical question. As I said, these women are poor or poorer. For instance, in the US, there is a whole group of women, they're called army wives. And so their husbands are in the army, they don't get a lot of salary. And many of these army wives are on surrogate agencies' books. They say, hey, you're just sitting there, you haven't got much to do, you're bored. Why don't you become a surrogate and have this baby, and you get maybe $10,000 or $20,000? And so they do it. So to call that choice is a total misnomer. There is no choice. And as soon as you go to other countries, poorer countries, the choice gets even more ridiculous. Like in India, when you earn as being a laundry woman or a maid, and you earn like maybe $1,000 in a whole year, and then all of a sudden, if you become a surrogate, you maybe earn $10,000. Well, what sort of a choice is that? So people who use that argument, they should just go and think a bit more. It's not a proper argument.
I wonder, what are the kind of, health implications and psychological impacts that this practice has on not only the women, but the children born of surrogacy as well?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the women. It's actually very dangerous, both for the so-called egg provider, I don't really want to call her a donor, and for the woman who, is called a surrogate mother. They both have to take quite a lot of hormones, the so-called egg donor, in order to stimulate the growth of her ovaries, so that they produce more than the one egg that we normally produce in 1 month. And they can then be harvested, so-called harvested, that is the term they use. That's an operation that leads to damage of the bladder, can lead to the damage of bladder, of ovaries. Women can lose their own fertility. And, they often do it because they say, oh, I really want to help some infertile women to have children. That's not a good way of actually trying to help somebody, but also earn some money. For the so-called surrogate mother, she also has to start taking hormones, which nobody taking hormones, that's a good thing for their body. And then if the embryo is implanted, and if it actually starts to grow, which often doesn't work, they have to do it 2, 3, 4, 5 times. A pregnancy that has an embryo that is implanted and is a so-called foreign embryo, meaning it doesn't have any kind of genetic material from the mother who grows it in her body, comes with many more dangers. So a pregnant woman, pregnant with an implanted embryo that's a foreign embryo, has higher chances of getting gestational diabetes, pregnancy problems at the end, like pre-eclampsia, for instance, which is a life-threatening condition for both mother and the child, and often leads to an emergent cesarean. And most surrogacy pregnancies actually end with a cesarean. That is often so that the couple, the buyers, can be there, can when the woman is sedated or from the anesthesia, they basically take the child away. So she never sees it. The poor child doesn't get any mother milk and is basically taken from his or her mother. Now, this is something that I have written about and said, well, has this child ever asked to be a takeaway baby? And the question, of course, is no, it hasn't. So it reminds us, and we have a lot of good allies from people who have been adopted and are very, very critical of adoption. It reminds us of unmarried mothers, and I know you had it in Ireland too, in the 60s and 70s, whose children were taken from them under the guise of like, oh, well, you're a fallen woman, you can't keep this child is going to a good, respectable couple. And these children, of course, very often were for decades looking for this birth mother. And so we're doing exactly the same. We're taking children away from women who've given birth to them. And we just say, oh, well, it's not the real mother. The real mother is now the buying couple and we're the social parents. And in most cases, I think of commercial surrogacy, the real mother, the birth mother, will never see that child again. And the child will never find out who she was. And the egg donor even less, because especially in America, egg donation is anonymous. And so this child has no chance of ever finding out where actually his or her second lot of genes come from. They only know who the male genes come from, with the father. And that's a big problem, apart from wanting to know who you are and where you come from and where your ancestors are, who your ancestors are. It's also got a problem about your medical history. Because what if these people had a medical history, for instance, of diabetes or heart disease? Shouldn't you know about this? And they don't do it. So it's quite amazing, really, totally unethical that in the 21st century, we're doing something that, has been condemned. And like, for instance, in Australia in 2013, when we had our first and only and probably last female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, she apologized to these single women who had their babies taken away. It was a very moving speech. And she said, this will never happen again. We will never do that. We will never deprive a woman of the smell of her baby, of waking up next to her baby, of knowing her baby. Ha! And they're doing it all again, all over again. So very sad. And yes, it is a human rights violation of the woman, but it is also a human rights violation of the children. And we really need to call that out for what it is.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything more that you can tell us about the process that women go through? I know you've answered a bit of that already, but if there's anything else to add on.
Yes, it's just that, as I said, most women go through surrogate agencies in countries where commercial surrogacy is legal, and they have to sign a contract. There's lawyers involved, and the contract basically takes away any control over their lives. Now, the contracts vary, and so some contracts will say you're not allowed to have sex with anybody else, not even your husband, for the first 3 months. Another contract says if we're going to do regular checks of the embryo and then fetus, and if there's something wrong with it, you have to abort it. Even despite the fact that this woman might actually not be against abortion, she has no say. She really signs her life away. Then there's more stupid things like you're not allowed to use hairspray because that's bad for the growing baby. You should listen to Mozart because, some people say that whatever the baby hears when she or he is in the mother's womb will then stay with them. You have to eat these good foods. You're not allowed to eat chocolate or junk food or never have fries. So the whole pregnancy is totally regulated. If there's complications, it's not, she doesn't decide whether she goes into hospital or not. It's all in the contract. And if the baby buyers decide it's too risky, she has to come to hospital and we're going to have a premature birth, then she goes. There's also something which I personally find just so horrible, and that's called reduction of surplus embryos. Now, that can happen in 2 ways. Sometimes embryos actually divide spontaneously, and all of a sudden, instead of having 1 embryo and then fetus when they grow, you have 2. And some people say, oh, no, we can't cope with that. We want 1 child. We don't want 2 children. And then, and other times, the doctors, the IVF doctors, they implant more than 1 embryo. So they implant maybe 2 or 3. And then again, the people say, no, we only want 1 child. So then they do what's called fetal reduction, which is a horrible, horrible process, which means that with a syringe, salt is injected into one of the fetus's heart, the one that is deemed, less good or inferior, or that maybe they say, oh, maybe it has a genetic anomaly, so we should get rid of it. So then this fetus heart stops beating and the fetus dies. And this fetus stays in the woman's body and is absorbed by the woman gradually. But it is next to the other embryo or fetus who keeps on growing. And, I support a woman's right to abortion. I don't like abortion, but I think we have to have it. It's really important for women to have access to safe abortion. And I find this really, really horrible, this idea that you're a fetus, you're developing, and we know so little still about what's actually happening in that period, when we are all fetuses in our mother's wombs. And next to you is this decaying, dead fetus that was supposed to be your brother or your sister. So I find that really, really, really actually quite hard to stomach. But think about if you were a pro-life woman, what that would mean. And of course, nobody thinks of that. It's just, if it's in your contract, you have to agree to fetal reduction, it gets done. That's only one example. There's so many unethical things that happen in IVF, and which is really the basis of surrogacy.
So you talked about how people feel entitled to surrogacy, and I wonder what you think is behind that attitude. Like, what motivates people to think that they're entitled to a child or to abuse women in this way?
That's a very good question, and I don't really think we have a lot of good answers to it. I think that it's social contagion to a big, that's a big factor, because, you know, almost every day or at least every week there is a wonderful story of either celebrities or two gay men or whatever, a heterosexual couple, and they're so happy because they got their child. And so it's like with IVF itself, you know, if a woman is infertile or her partner has a problem, these days it's just assumed she goes into IVF. You know, the neighbor will say, the doctor will say, the teacher will say, well, I presume you have tried IVF. Yes, I have, like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And then she's over 40. It's not going to work anymore because her eggs truly don't want to do it anymore. And so then the IVF doctor says, you don't have to stop. There is another option. You can go into surrogacy. And so it's become something like, yeah, and then I do surrogacy. And when we keep saying, but you're treating these women not as human beings, but as breeders, as incubators, as suitcases, they just say, no, and she wants to do it. Often they say, she wants to do this for us. She wants to help us. She wants to give the gift. She wants to give us the gift of life. That's one of their sentences. And then unfortunately, you do also have surrogates, actually more so in altruistic surrogacy. We have that in Australia. And they themselves come out and say, oh, I was so happy I could help this couple to have their baby. And then I was so happy and I'm so happy. And so people just think it's something really good. They have also no idea how many dangerous drugs are involved, that in fact the women can die and have died during the pregnancy or during birth. And, you know, it's not just them dying. They have to have their own children. Mostly they have to have had 2 children. So they leave their own children as orphans. They leave a partner. That is just, you don't talk about this. You just talk about the nice things when, you know, Nicole Kidman, who is one of our movie stars, has another baby. And in her case, she didn't even thank the surrogate mother, let alone give her a name. She thanked my gestational surrogate. That was the term she used. So it's a total, you know, it really is. I mean, I said it before, it's really like slavery. It's like this. On the one hand, you say these women give the gift of life. On the other hand, you really treat them like they're not people, they're not persons. But it's a good question. I don't really know what else. It's entitlement also. And it's like, oh, the neighbor went and had surrogacy and now they have a baby. Maybe we should do that too. So it's the term that's been used in the context of young women who now think they're all trans. As Abigail Shrier has said in the US, it's social contagious. That's actually a term that Lisa Littman, who has done research on this, has invented. And I think you can use that for surrogacy too. It's social contagion.
You've mentioned before the term reproductive prostitution. So what do you think is the connection between surrogacy and trafficking?
Well, first of all, the reproductive prostitution angle, you know, in prostitution, a man buys access to a woman's vagina. And in surrogacy, a man who wants his genes to be passed on to the next generation buys a woman's uterus. So that's a very direct comparison. And as for trafficking, well, the children are trafficked. These children that are born to the woman who made them in her body, they're taken away. They are sometimes taken away to different countries. If, for instance, a couple comes from say, Poland, and they come to the US and they have surrogacy there, and then this child gets taken back to Poland. And chances are that they will never know that their so-called surrogate, or their birth mother, their mother, was actually in the US. So it's trafficking of babies.
So I know you've already touched on it a bit about altruistic surrogacy already, but we've read the book, and I think people don't seem to understand what kind of issues can arise in those situations. For example, maybe the mother feels a connection to her baby and wants to keep it. So I wonder if you could illustrate for us a bit why there isn't, this huge distinction between commercial and altruistic, ethically speaking.
Yeah, I actually think they're really the same. And in fact, I actually think that altruistic surrogacy is even more unethical than commercial surrogacy. Now, some people find that astonishing, but I think that in commercial surrogacy, if a poor woman becomes a surrogate because she can do with this money to pay school fees or to pay a mortgage or just basically pay for her bread and milk, okay, I mean, I don't condone it, I don't like it, but she has a reason. But in altruistic surrogacy, you're supposed to do it because you do it out of love. There's no money involved, although that's not quite true, because the baby buyers have to pay for all the expenses to do with the pregnancy and then the birth, maternity clothes, and so on. But nevertheless, it is said that altruistic surrogacy is just for love. And in a book that we have edited, which is called Broken Bonds, we have a story by an Australian woman who was an altruistic so-called surrogate for her cousin. Now, her cousin is something like 4 years older than her. She loved her cousin very much. She thought she was the best person in the whole world. Then the cousin had cancer. Then the cousin couldn't have babies. And so she said to her, can you have a baby for me? And because she got pregnant really easily, she said, yes, of course I do. Well, things got already very, very bad during the pregnancy because the cousin kept saying, you'll have a miscarriage, I know you'll have a miscarriage. And started to treat her really, really badly. And then around the birth, it got really shocking. And she cancelled their birthing suite and really mean stuff. Anyway, the baby was born as it was in the contract, because even in altruistic surrogacy, you have a lawyer, you have a contract, and the contract said you have to hand this baby over. So she handed the baby over, but then she actually felt that she had wanted to keep the baby, and off they went to family court. And the family court, of course, said that no, you said this baby was for your cousin, you can't keep it. And then the other argument was that the cousin owed her $20,000 for medical expenses. And the cousin said, no, we're not going to pay this. So 6 years later, since this child was born, it's a boy, she hasn't seen it. Odette, it's not the real name. She couldn't use her real name, but Odette has not seen her son ever again. She has asked for photos. She has asked to please see him. No, nothing. And it has split the whole family. It's a very, very big family, and they don't talk to one another anymore. And in fact, somebody offered to pay this outstanding $20,000 just to make peace. And Odette said, no, I don't want that. I want it to be paid by my cousin and her husband. It's still going through the courts. When we launched this book, the Broken Bonds book in Melbourne, the cousin, this is all true, the cousin sent a private investigator to shadow us and to see if we would slip and mention the woman's real name, because the court had decided that she could talk about her surrogacy, but she was not allowed to use her real name. So we tried very, very, very hard not to use her real name. I think we slipped once. But anyway, the fact that she paid for a private investigator to come to this conference on surrogacy, it was an international conference, and to the book launch, tells you that, I mean, the things that are involved in that are so unethical and they're so painful. And as I said, they're split families. So I think altruistic surrogacy really has to be condemned as much as commercial surrogacy.
And there's a big movement in Ireland at the moment in favour of surrogacy and trying to promote it, as you said, as kind of creating happy families. What do you think of the way the media covers this issue?
The media has been terrible. The media really only promotes the happy stories, and if something goes wrong, it just gets put under the carpet. Now, Spinifex, you know, who I work with and have started together with my partner Susan Hawthorne more than 30 years ago, we published now, I think, 4 books against surrogacy, critical of surrogacy. And the books, they sell quite well, especially overseas. But in Australia, we can hardly get any good reviews. Now, my book called Surrogacy, a Human Rights Violation, which was published in 2017, I actually got a few reviews. That was really quite surprising. But in general, the media likes to just hear happy stories of happy parents. And also, then, if they can get a picture of the surrogate mother who says, oh, yes, I was so happy I could fulfill their wish, then that's even better. And like 2 weeks ago, we had this story from Victoria. Now, Victoria, the state of Victoria has quite strict regulations. You have to go through a patient panel, and you have to fulfill a lot of requirements before you are admitted. But you can be a single man, and that is what happened. So a single, turned out to be gay man, was described in the press as a happy first for Victoria. Single man becomes father of baby. Well, actually, he didn't really, she had the baby, but never mind. And, you know, beaming father, beaming man with baby in arms. And then next to it was actually a picture of the surrogate mother, and she even had a name. That is very unusual. But it did not say anything about who the egg donor was. So in other words, that got totally left out of the article, who the genetic mother was, who the other half of the genes came from. And it was just like, oh, how wonderful. And then, you know, this single man has now found love as well. He's got a partner and 2 dogs, and everything is just fantastic. Where does the breast milk come from? We didn't hear. Is the surrogate mother probably the nanny now? That didn't get said. It was just a celebration of the state of Victoria now allowing single men to have babies. And you know, when I speak about this, and then usually somebody comes and says, yeah, I agree with all your criticism and all that, but how else can gay men or single men have babies? And you have to stop for a moment. And I said, you know, actually, men don't really have babies. It's women who have babies. So why should all of a sudden men be enabled by using a woman as a breeder to have a baby that has part of their genes in it? It's just bizarre, but it's sort of like, it's become the new normal. You go into IVF, if that doesn't work, you go into surrogacy. And then in the same article, they had an IVF a woman who is in charge of an IVF clinic, and she said, yes, we should have commercial surrogacy in Australia. We don't have enough women who come forward as surrogate mothers. Now you wonder why. And egg donors. Now you wonder why in Australia you're not allowed to pay for egg donation. So she said, we should really have commercial surrogacy. Now that's not going to happen in Australia very soon, because in 2016 we had a federal inquiry, and surrogacy is regulated by all the different states, but it was a federal inquiry, and it was very clear that commercial surrogacy was not even being looked at. But it is definitely there, and it's just, we have to really be strong and argue against it.
So for Ireland, like most Irish couples who want to use surrogacy, or however you put it, they go to Ukraine to do that. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit, maybe specifically, about how the industry works in Ukraine.
Ukraine, even before this horrible war that started, it was always a really, really bad case of unregulated surrogacy with total power to the baby buyers and very little power to the mothers. There are a lot of different surrogacy agencies in Ukraine. It is actually legal, but very badly regulated. There, as far as I know, there are different factions. Well, there were before the war. I think now they have different problems. Some wanted to really do away with surrogacy, make it illegal, and others wanted to regulate it better. But you can't regulate something that's bad. It's not possible. But the war has just has really shone a light on how absolutely terrible it is. So in Australia, big stuff in the media. Oh, these poor parents who don't know where their baby is. You know, it's actually, the question was, where is the so-called surrogate mother, where's the birth mother? But now, where are the babies? And they're going to rush to Ukraine, despite the foreign department saying, don't go, it's too dangerous. So they rushed to Ukraine. In one case, they actually found the baby. Not a word what happened to the mother. And did they pay the mother? Well, I hope they did. Where was she? So it was all about, the babies, where are they? And of course, there are still women who are pregnant now. And what can they do? And there's the problem that if they go to, let's say, to Poland, if they give birth in Poland, they are the parents, because Poland doesn't do surrogacy. And so any contract that they had with the Ukrainian agency is null and void. And then, of course, the baby buyers, they would then have to take this baby and bring it back to wherever they came from, which is another scandal. Like in Australia, it is in three different, 2 states and 1 territory. It is illegal. It's illegal to go overseas and do commercial surrogacy. It's a criminal act in Queensland, in New South Wales, and you can be fined $100,000 or go to jail for a year. That's in the act. It's been there for 10 years, more than 10 years. Do you think a single person has been prosecuted? No. So they come back from overseas, whether it's Ukraine or whether it's US or Canada. They bring this baby. They come they come off the plane, and a person from Border Force, as we call our border control, lets them in. And instead of saying, well, excuse me, this baby, how was it born? Who's the mother, who's the father, No, they're just let in, and you never hear about it anymore. And it's wrong. And we have said this so many times. We've written to the various attorney generals will have to do it again. And now, of course, we have this election, so nobody wants to know about this. And we just don't seem to be able to do anything. And then another thing which is really important to talk about, and I don't know if you have that in Ireland, but we have this group called Growing Families. Used to be Surrogacy Australia. And the person who drives it, and honestly gets asked in every single media interview, his name is Sam Everingham. Now, Sam is a gay man, and he went to India with his partner, and they got themselves 2 little baby girls. They used 2 surrogates because the first surrogate they used, unfortunately, had a miscarriage. So then they thought, oh, we'll better use 2. So we've got 2 babies. So this Sam goes and has seminars every 2 or 3 months in those states where surrogacy is a criminal act. And you wouldn't believe it, we cannot stop him. But it's not so unusual, because I just heard from an Italian friend that there's going to be a baby fair in Milan. Now, Italy does not allow surrogacy. Germany does not allow surrogacy, and yet every year they have the Kinderwunschtage, which is also the baby fairs. And I know that this Sam Everingham from Growing Families goes to Dublin and has seminars there. So you should check on this. I'm not entirely sure when his next seminar is, but if he's there, you should really protest him, because what's his business coming to Ireland and telling Irish people, they should do surrogacy? That's also where capitalism, gets into the picture. They are all about making money. And this Growing Families is supposed to be a charity. And we have ASIC, which is the regulator of financial affairs, and you can find out how much money charities made. And in 2 years, this Growing Families charity made $3 million. And it is mostly from these seminars that they give. Now, what could we do with $3 million? We could run fabulous campaigns against surrogacy internationally. So it's just rigged. It really is rigged.
You've touched on this a bit already, but since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, what's the position now for women that are being used in surrogacy?
Well, it's shocking. It really is shocking. And of course, I don't have a lot of direct information. It's basically what we hear. Initially, we heard that one of the biggest surrogacy clinics called Biotexcom, they showed us cellars that had been fitted out so that the women could give birth, etc., etc. That was in Kiev. Now, I have no idea what has happened. If women indeed did stay in Kiev and had given birth. But, many will still be pregnant, as I said. Some of them might have decided they don't want to stay in Ukraine anymore. They want to go to a safer country like Poland or Germany. And if they go, then that's a problem with the child. So it just goes to show that these women are expendable. They are really, really expendable. And all that is written in at least the media in Australia, in America as well, they care about what's happening to the babies. That was actually a similar situation in Nepal. Some years ago, there was an earthquake in Nepal, and Nepal was mostly frequented by Israeli men who wanted their babies. And so all these men raced to Nepal, not to get the women out. And the women were actually women who were trafficked from India to Nepal and then were surrogates there. Not to get these women out, but to get their babies out and back to Israel. And that was a bit of a scandal. That got reported in the in the international press and saying, oh, that's probably not so good, that's probably not very ethical. And what's happening in Ukraine right now, it's that. But since the first maybe 2-3 weeks of the war, when there were reports in the newspapers about, the poor parents who couldn't get to their babies, I haven't seen any new reports, so I can only dread to think what's happening to these poor pregnant women. I mean, it's a very shocking situation. Should never, ever have happened.
It's so horrible. It's the whole thing's just so dehumanizing.
Very
I wonder,
dehumanizing. Yeah.
What do you think, this sort of acceptance of this industry and surrogacy in general says about how women and children are viewed by society?
Well, women, we don't really exist. We are just basically expendable. We're either used in prostitution, our vaginas are used, or we're used in surrogacy, our uteruses are used. What happens to the rest of us is basically not interesting. We are just there to be used for men. And we're going to publish a really interesting book by Sheila Jeffries, who I'm sure you know, and it's called Penile Imperialism. And she details how, many women think, oh, we're so equal, we live in a free world, we've got it so good. And she basically details how women really live under sexual terrorism by men. I mean, there's the enormous amount of rapes, which I'm sure you have in Ireland too. But for me, surrogacy and prostitution, they're extension of that. They're violence against women. And the fact that it's becoming more and more acceptable tells me that really women are expendable. And, if you look at the whole trans issue, that also tells you that women are totally expendable. We're not even allowed to be a sex class anymore. We should just have men join us and say they're lesbians, despite the fact they have a penis, and women have to accept that. I think what we need is a new women's revolution. There has to be your generation who goes on the barricades again and just says it's simply gone too far. We are a sex class, we are women, we've got rights, and we are not appendages to men, either as vaginas or as with our wombs. This has to stop. But we don't have control of the media. And especially with surrogacy, there's also this constant moaning and groaning. Oh, these poor people, they really, 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 really want a child or another child, or, as I said earlier, in the case of two gay men, they're socially infertile. How else can they get a child? And they have to have that child. I mean, it's the whole thing that you can have a very, very happy life without your own biological children. There's many, many ways of having children in your life if you so wish. And we know from adoption how bad the outcome was for so many children who were adopted. And now we're doing it all again. And we just have to also say we have to look at the whole concept of child-free living, and that's okay. Women who don't have children are not second-class citizens. They are fully human beings who, for one reason or another, have decided not to have children. Now, I've done a lot of research on infertility, and I really know how devastating it can be when you think you really want a baby and then it's just not happening, and how it can become an obsession as well. And we just have to work against that without blaming the women and say we have to have a better climate where to be a woman who has not had a child doesn't mean she's an inferior human being. So I think that's another really important issue. We had that campaign in the 1990s, but it's sort of like not very active anymore. So we need to get back to that and say, well, yeah, having children is very nice, but you know, people can live very, very happy lives without their own biological children. We have published another book, and it's called Towards the Abolition of Surrogate Motherhood, and I will actually send you a copy of that. We're also going to have a launch of that book on the 28th of April. I'll send you that information. And it's a book with 15 contributors. There's also a French version. A lot of them are from European countries like France and Spain and Italy. And I think we just have to keep on writing. There's a wonderful feminist convention in the book also that lists all that's wrong, legally speaking, with surrogacy, how it contravenes all the UN, acts that we have, trafficking, slavery, on the status of women. We just have to keep saying it. We have to work together across boundaries, international networking amongst women. And we have to not be intimidated by people who say, oh, you're so mean. You don't like these poor people, who are so heartbroken, and you don't want them to have children. And says nothing about that. It's about human dignity, and it's about not using women as breeders and incubators, and not using women in prostitution as well as just vaginas. One thing we also have to say is that surrogacy cannot be regulated, because then some people say, well, all right, then there's bad surrogacy and there's good surrogacy. So let's not have the bad surrogacy, let's have the good surrogacy. And that's actually a very dangerous move at the moment. There's a group in Europe who has some very powerful women in it who used to be working with the UN, and they have come out with something called the Verona Principles, and in which they don't care at all about the women, it's all about the children. So they want to make sure that the children in surrogacy are treated well and have the best possible prospects. And so therefore they say we have to weed out all the bad operators, we have to have clear parentage. And what they want to achieve is that countries, let's say like Germany, in which surrogacy is prohibited, they want Germany to accept, when the babies come to their borders, to accept them in. And so that's why they want parentage laws. And they are incredibly dangerous because they sound so reasonable, because they say, we really want the best for the children. And a lot of people will fall for that because, it sounds good. And one of the women was a rapporteur for the UN. So she comes with enormous connections and credentials. And that's a very big, big challenge for our European friends and sisters in France. But, we have to take it on, and we have to build our networks. As I said, Stop Surrogacy Now, and the SIAMs in France and in Australia, we have a small group called APSA, Abolish Surrogacy Australia. That's all we can do. And we need to agitate, we need to give speeches, we need to write books, and we need to basically, pull our finger at groups like Growing Families that do their unethical talks in a number of countries. We just have to really be like the suffragettes 100 years ago, or then, the second wave feminists 50 years ago. Please start a new movement, a new women's movement that actually is against all these fundamental affronts to a woman's human dignity.